Sleet pounded the glass of the Red Maple Inn, blurring the pine trees of Blackberry Hollow into dark shapes. Maeve rubbed her aching arms, wiping the sticky counter with an old rag that smelled of stale cider and vinegar. The tavern was quiet, except for the crackle of a dying wood fire that refused to keep the draft out. She owed $30 to the town council, and her pockets held nothing but a few smooth pebbles and lint. Then the heavy front door opened without a sound, letting in a blast of freezing mountain air that made the oil lamps flicker. A man stepped inside, shutting the storm out behind him with a gentle push of his hand. He stood near the rug, water dripping from the hem of his long black coat onto the clean pine boards. Maeve blinked, caught off guard by his looks. He had hair as white as the fresh snow outside, falling in damp strands across a face that was completely pale, like carved marble. His eyes were alight, cold gray, showing a deep weariness that seemed to pull at his broad shoulders. He did not shiver, despite the freezing cold, and his breath did not form a white mist in the chilly room. He walked to the bar with slow, quiet steps that made no sound at all. He reached into his deep coat pocket and placed 3 copper coins on the counter. The metal made a tiny clinking sound against the dark wood. His hand was smooth, with long, thin fingers that looked completely unbattered by hard labor, though his skin was white and ice-cold. He looked down at the coppers, not meeting her eyes. He asked for the smallest bed in the attic, his voice low and smooth like velvet, but rough around the edges from long travel. He said he only needed a dry roof for the night. Maeve looked at the 3 cents, then at his pale face and white hair. 3 coppers would not buy a loaf of bread, let alone a bed in a mountain winter. Her inn was failing, and she needed real money to pay the town officials before they seized her property. She should have told him to leave, to find a barn, or sleep under the pines. But something about his quiet exhaustion stopped her words. She felt a sudden surge of stubborn anger at how miserable he looked. She snatched the coppers and dropped them into her apron pocket. Instead of reaching for the rusty key to the drafty attic, her fingers wrapped around a polished brass key. She set it on the counter with a loud thud. She told him he had room 4 at the end of the hall upstairs. She told him it had a real fireplace and a thick mattress, warning him not to track mud on her clean rugs, or she would make him wash them. The white-haired man looked at the key, then lifted his light gray eyes to hers. A look of clear confusion crossed his pale face. He told her quietly that he could not afford room 4, as 3 coppers were all he had left. Maeve snapped at him, saying she did not care about his money. She lied and said the attic roof had leaked during the storm, soaking the old cots with icy water. She told him to take the key before she grew angry. He paused, his gray eyes searching her face for a long moment. It looked like a quiet battle was happening inside his head, pride fighting against a deep need to rest. Finally, his long, white fingers picked up the brass key from the wood. He murmured a quiet thank you and turned toward the stairs, walking with a slight, barely noticeable favor to his left leg. Maeve watched his white hair disappear into the shadows of the hallway. The moment he was gone, she leaned against the bar and cursed herself in a whisper. She was a fool for giving away her best room for 3 copper cents when she was facing ruin. She picked up her rag and began to scrub the counter again, working until her skin was red and raw. She was angry at the storm, angry at the town council, and mostly angry at herself for being soft. The morning sun did not bring warmth, only a pale gray light that turned the snow outside into a dull sheet of ice. Maeve was awake before 6 o'clock. Her hands plunged into a bucket of freezing water as she peeled wrinkled potatoes. Her lower back ached with a familiar, dull throb that never really left her. The storm had stopped, leaving the mountain valley quiet and buried. She figured the white-haired stranger would be gone by now, since men who looked like ghosts usually slipped away before dawn. She told herself she was glad he was gone, because she had cleared her conscience by giving him a warm bed. Now, she could go back to the harsh math of trying to keep her home. Then she heard the quiet creak of the wooden stairs. She stopped her knife, leaving it hovering over a half-peeled potato. Slow, even footsteps crossed the empty dining room. She wiped her wet hands on her apron and pushed open the kitchen door. He was sitting at a small table in the far corner, away from the frosted windows. In the clear morning light, His white hair looked almost silver, and his pale skin was so translucent she could see the faint blue veins beneath it. He sat with his back perfectly straight, his long hands resting flat on the table, completely still. Maeve marched over and set a wooden bowl of hot cornmeal mush down in front of him. She told him breakfast cost extra, keeping her voice sharp. He did not blink or look upset by her cold tone. He looked at the simple yellow mush as if it were a fine feast and thanked her softly. He picked up the wooden spoon, holding it with an odd, quiet elegance that did not fit his ruined black coat. Maeve stayed nearby, picking up a cloth to wipe down the next table so she could watch him. "The attic roof is completely fine," he said suddenly, his voice smooth and steady. Maeve froze, her cloth stopping on the wood. She did not look up immediately. He took a small bite of the mush, chewing slowly. He told her he had looked up the stairwell on his way down, and the plaster was dry and whole. He asked her why she had given him the best room in the house for 3 copper cents. Caught in her own lie, Maeve felt a warm flush creep up her cheeks. She put her hands on her hips and turned to face him fully, using her anger to hide her embarrassment. She told him she simply did not want a frozen corpse in her attic because dead bodies were bad for business. She said the town undertaker charged $5 to haul away strangers, and she did not have the money to pay it. A tiny, dry sound came from his throat, and Maeve realized he was laughing. It was a short, unused sound that faded quickly. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a heavy silver coin on the table, sliding it across the wood toward her. Maeve looked down at it. It was a heavy silver dollar, bright and unblemished, showing the face of a lady carved into the metal. It was enough to pay for the room for a whole week. He told her he needed the room for another night, if she would have him. Maeve stared at the silver, wanting to grab it but keeping her hands flat on her hips. She asked him where a man with a ruined coat found a coin like that. He answered simply that he had traded his horse to a trader 2 miles down the road because the animal could go no further in the deep snow. He looked up, his light gray eyes meeting hers. He told her the coin was not stolen, giving her his word. Maeve scoffed, but she picked up the silver dollar and dropped it into her pocket, where it felt heavy against her thigh. She told him his name was still missing from her ledger. He looked at the fire and said his name was Caspian. Maeve told him he could stay, but if he caused trouble, she would throw him into the snow. 8 days passed, and Caspian did not leave the Red Maple. Every morning he paid his silver, ate the simple meals she made without a single complaint, and kept entirely to himself. He was like a quiet shadow in the house, only appearing when the sun went down. Maeve tried to ignore him because she had a business to run and bills to worry about, but she found herself noticing the small things he left behind. It started with the front porch steps. The third wooden step had been split for 6 months, groaning loudly whenever a customer stepped on it, and Maeve had lacked the tools to fix it. On the 9th morning, she came down to find the wood replaced with a thick, sturdy piece of oak. The nails were driven straight and deep into the frame. Later that afternoon, she found the front door latch smoothed and oiled, closing with a soft, perfect click. She walked outside into the biting cold, wrapping her woolen shawl tightly around her neck. Caspian was standing near the woodpile behind the inn, his black coat draped over a fence post. He wore only a thin white shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, showing his pale arms. He held her heavy iron-splitting axe in one hand. Maeve stopped, watching him lift the tool with an ease that did not seem human. He brought the axe down in a swift, silent arc. The thick log of maple split completely in two with a clean crack. He did not pause to catch his breath, and his pale skin did not show a single drop of sweat despite the hard labor. He stacked the wood in neat, even rows against the stone wall. Maeve stepped forward, her boots crunching on the snow, making him freeze with the axe held mid-air. She told him she had not asked him to fix her porch or chop her wood, her voice sounding harsher than she meant it to. Caspian lowered the axe, his white hair blowing slightly in the cold wind. He told her the broken step was dangerous for her when she carried heavy water buckets from the well. Maeve crossed her arms, telling him she could not pay him for any carpentry work because her pockets were empty. "I did not ask for money, Maeve," he said quietly. It was the first time he had spoken her name, and the sound felt strange and formal coming from his pale lips. He picked up his long black coat and swung it over his shoulders. As he moved past her toward the back door, the collar of his white shirt shifted in the bright winter light. A thin silver chain slipped out from beneath the fabric. At the end of the chain hung a massive gold ring, holding a deep red stone carved with the shape of a crown. Maeve caught only a brief flash of it before he tucked it away, but it was enough to make her breath hitch. That was not the ring of a soldier or a traveler. It was a royal seal. She took a step back, her back pressing against the cold woodpile, as he stopped near the door. She asked him who he was running from, her voice dropping to a quiet whisper. Caspian did not turn around to face her. He stood perfectly still, looking at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. The air between them felt suddenly heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm. He told her he was running from his own people, and from a throne he could no longer bear to sit upon. Then he opened the door and disappeared inside. The paper of her account book felt damp and thin beneath her fingers. Maeve sat at the corner table, rubbing her temples as she stared at the faded ink lines. The numbers remained exactly the same, no matter how many times she added them. She needed $9 to clear her debt with the town, and the drawer under the bar held only 12 copper cents. The afternoon was quiet, the cold air keeping people inside their homes. The heavy front door was kicked open, slamming hard against the wall and letting in a flurry of gray snow. Gideon stepped into the room, his boots tracking thick brown mud across the floor Maeve had cleaned an hour ago. He was a small, sharp-faced man who collected the town fees, smelling of cheap tobacco and damp wool. He did not look at Maeve, instead looking up at the ceiling beams, as if estimating their value. "Your time is up, Maeve," Gideon said, his voice high and thin. He dropped a heavy leather book onto her clean table with a loud thud. Maeve stood up, placing her body between him and her account book to hide her miserable math. She told him the town council usually collected the fees at the end of the month, not 2 weeks early. She told him she needed more time to find the money. "The council changed the date because the county needs funds for the new road," Gideon lied, tapping a dirty fingernail against his book. He told her he needed $9 today, plus a late fee of 50 cents for making him walk through the cold mud. Maeve felt a cold weight drop into her stomach. She told him she did not have the coins today, refusing to beg because begging never worked with men like Gideon. "Then you will pack your blankets and leave by sunset," Gideon said, reaching into his pocket to pull out a folded paper with a red wax seal. He told her a local land builder had already offered to buy the lot to build a new timber yard. Maeve gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. This inn was old and cold, but it was her father's house, and it was all she had. "The lady told you to come back at the end of the month," a voice said from the stairs. The tone was not loud, but it filled the room like a cold iron blade. Gideon jumped, spinning around toward the hallway. Caspian was walking down the steps, moving with a smooth, terrifying speed that made no sound. He did not favor his left leg today. He stopped 3 feet from the collector, looking down at him. Gideon took a quick step backward, his hand shaking slightly as he looked at Caspian's white hair and deathly pale skin. He asked who he was, telling him to mind his own business, because the town council did not care about wandering bums. Caspian did not look at Gideon's face. He looked down at the brown mud on the floorboards, his light gray eyes turning completely flat and dark. "You brought filth into a house she worked hard to clean," Caspian said softly, his voice carrying a strange weight that made the room feel smaller. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened the string and tipped it over, dropping 2 heavy gold coins onto the wooden table. They clattered against the pine, the sound bright and heavy in the quiet room. "Take your $9 and leave the paper," Caspian ordered, his eyes locking onto Gideon's. He told the collector that if he returned before the end of the month, he would ride to the capital and report him for taking bribes from timber companies. Gideon stared at the gold, his mouth open like a fish. He snatched one of the gold pieces with a greedy hand, dropped his paper, and ran out into the snow. The fire snapped in the hearth, throwing a small red ember onto the stone floor where it turned to black ash. It was past midnight, and the inn was locked tight against a bitter frost that was freezing the window glass into solid white sheets. Maeve sat in her wooden chair, a patchwork quilt pulled over her knees. Caspian sat on a low stool on the other side of the hearth, working on a hunting knife. The steady scraping of the stone against the steel blade was the only sound in the dark room. He worked with slow, perfect movements, his eyes fixed on the yellow flames. Maeve held a cup of warm cider, using the heat to warm her numb fingers. The gold coin remained in her apron pocket, feeling like a hot coal against her thigh. She asked him why a man with gold and a royal ring wore a coat held together by old string. "A coat tells people what you are," Caspian answered, without looking up from the knife. He told her, "Gold only tells people how they can use you." Maeve took a slow sip of her cider, telling him he spoke like someone who had never known what it felt like to go hungry. Caspian paused, setting the stone on the floor, and looked at her across the firelight. "You think you know me, Maeve," he said, his voice a low rumble. Maeve leaned forward, letting her quilt slip to the floor. She told him she did not need to guess, because he carried himself like a ruler, threw gold at town officials without blinking, and had a ring that could buy the whole valley. She told him he was either a high lord or a king, and she wanted to know the truth. "A king," Caspian repeated, the words sounding bitter and heavy as he spoke it. He told her a king was just a man who counted live bodies and dead bodies, sending people to die for land they had never seen. He closed his eyes, the muscles in his pale jaw tightening until his skin looked like stone. He told her that 3 weeks ago, his court had ordered him to destroy a human town on the border. They wanted every house burned and every person killed because they refused to pay a blood tithe, Caspian whispered, his hands tightening into fists. He told her he had refused the order. His general had called him a traitor to his own kind, telling him his duty was to the night clans. Caspian opened his eyes, and they looked hollow and dark in the dim firelight. "So you ran away," Maeve said quietly, her heart beating fast against her ribs. Caspian shook his head, telling her he had broken his general's jaw, taken his gold, and ridden his horse until it died in the snow. Then he had walked the rest of the way to her door. Maeve looked at his pale, clean hands, realizing the truth of what he was. He was a vampire, a king who had given up his crown to save a village of humans. She stood up, her wooden chair scraping loudly against the pine floor. She walked over to him and held out her cup of cider, telling him to drink it because he looked like a ghost. Caspian hesitated, his long fingers brushing against hers as he took the cup. His skin was freezing cold, like ice from the river. He took a small sip and smiled faintly, telling her she was a very rough host. "I am a person who stays alive," Maeve said, stepping back to her chair. She told him his sad story did not mean he got free room and board, and he still owed her for fixing the porch steps. Caspian looked down at the cup, his small smile staying for a second longer. He told her to add it to his bill, and she sat down, watching the firelight dance across his white hair. A sharp, ragged scream cut through the floorboards, waking Maeve from her sleep. She sat up in her narrow cot, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. The attic room was dark and freezing cold. Another loud crash came from below, followed by the sound of heavy wood splintering against the floor. It was coming from room 4. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the icy floorboards. She did not grab her shawl. She snatched a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and ran down the narrow stairs to the second floor. The door to room 4 was closed, but the sound of a violent struggle came from inside. Maeve slammed her hand against the latch and shoved the door open, her breath coming in quick gasps. The room was bright with the blue light of the full moon. The heavy wooden chair was overturned, and the ceramic water basin lay shattered into a dozen pieces across the floor. Caspian was on the rug, tangled in his white sheets, fighting an enemy that was not there. He was breathing in loud, ragged gasps, his fists striking the wood as he tried to break free from the cloth. His white hair was damp with cold sweat clinging to his face. "No," he choked out, his voice raw and stripped of its smooth tone. He shouted for them to leave the houses alone, begging someone not to light the fire. Maeve stood frozen for a second, realizing this was not the powerful king who had scared the town collector. This was a man drowning in his own bad memories. She dropped her iron poker and crossed the room, kneeling on the wet floor beside him. She reached out to shake his shoulder, but the moment her fingers touched his arm, he moved with terrifying speed. His hand shot out, clamping around her wrist like a metal band. He pulled her down toward him, his other hand coming up to protect his face. His light gray eyes snapped open, but they were wild and dark, seeing a burning village instead of her room. A sharp pain shot up Maeve's arm as his grip tightened, cold and heavy enough to break her bones. She did not scream or try to pull away from him. She leaned closer, keeping her voice loud and firm. She called his name, telling him to stop and look at her face. Caspian gasped, his breath coming too fast as he looked through her, still trapped in his mind. "There is no fire here, Caspian," Maeve said, her voice sounding like a solid anchor in the dark room. She used her free hand to grip his pale jaw, holding his face firmly so he had to look at her. His skin felt like frozen stone against her palms. She told him he was at the Red Maple Inn, and it was winter. She told him to look at her, repeating her name until his eyes cleared. Slowly, the terrible tension in his body began to break. The wild look in his eyes faded, replaced by a sudden, quiet clarity as he felt her hand on his face. He looked down at his own hand, realizing he was crushing her wrist. He let go instantly, scrambling backward until his back hit the wooden bed frame. He pulled his knees to his chest and buried his face in his hands, shaking all over. Maeve stayed on the floor, rubbing her bruised wrist where the skin was already turning red. She did not tell him everything was fine because she could see the deep pain in his shoulders. She reached over, picked up the heavy wool blanket he had kicked away, and threw it over his back. She told him the broken basin cost 50 cents, and he would be sweeping up the pieces in the morning. Caspian let out a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, keeping his face hidden in his knees. He whispered that he would sweep it up. Maeve sat on the cold floor beside him, her back against the bed frame, and she did not leave his side. They sat together in the moonlight, two lonely people holding on to each other while the wind whistled outside the window. The morning after his nightmare tasted of old dust and cold iron. Maeve came down the stairs to the kitchen, her left wrist wrapped in a piece of old cloth to hide the dark purple bruise Caspian had left behind. She expected the kitchen to be cold and empty, but instead she smelled the rich scent of fried onions and rendered fat. The room was warm, the large stove filled with roaring wood. Caspian was standing by the black iron stove, his white sleeves rolled up past his elbows, showing the long pale scars on his arms. He was stirring a large copper pot with a long wooden spoon, his movements steady and focused. He did not turn around when she walked in, but he spoke quietly, telling her the broken pieces of the basin were in the ash box and the floor was clean. "I will add the 50 cents to your account," Maeve said, walking over to the table where a sack of winter potatoes sat. Caspian turned to look at her, his light gray eyes showing deep dark circles underneath, making him look even paler than usual. He told her he had found some dried beans and salted meat in her cellar, and he was making a simple stew that soldiers ate during long winters. "We do not serve food to the townspeople here," Maeve said, lifting a potato. Caspian told her she should start, because he had seen the woodcutters walking past the inn earlier, looking frozen and miserable. He said she could sell a bowl of hot stew and a piece of bread for 5 copper cents, clearing out her old cellar stock and making a good profit before the sun went down. Maeve stared at him, realizing he was acting like a camp manager instead of a hidden king. She dropped her potato, walked over to the stove, and took a clean spoon to taste the thick brown broth. It was hot, salty, and full of garlic, exactly what a working man would want on a freezing day. She told him it needed more black pepper, throwing her spoon into the wash bucket. "There is no pepper in this kitchen, Maeve, only old salt and dried herbs," Caspian said, a tiny hint of amusement in his smooth voice. Maeve turned back to her work, telling him they would charge the woodcutters an extra copper to buy some pepper tomorrow. They worked together for the next 2 hours, moving around the small kitchen in a quiet, easy rhythm that felt completely natural. By noon, the front room of the inn was louder than it had been in a whole year. The smell of the hot meat stew had brought in 5 hungry men from the timber lot, and they paid their coppers gladly, scraping their bowls clean. Caspian stayed in the kitchen the entire time, washing the dishes and keeping the fire hot, never letting the customers see his white hair or pale skin. When the rush was over, Maeve leaned against the wooden counter, her apron stained with grease but her heart lighter than before. She pulled the coins from her pocket and counted them on the wood, finding 12 silver shillings and 30 coppers. She had not made that much money in a single day since her father died. The kitchen door opened, and Caspian walked out with a bucket of gray water. "It seems the old recipe worked well," he said, looking at the pile of coins on the bar. Maeve gathered the money into a small leather bag, pulling the string tight. She looked at him, noticing how his white shirt was covered in soot. She asked him why he was helping her so much when he had enough gold to buy a finer house anywhere else in the country. "Because my hands need work, Maeve," he said softly, setting the bucket down and leaning against the wooden post. He told her that if he stayed idle, his mind would return to the blood and the fire, and his mind was a dangerous place to be alone. He looked up, his gray eyes clear and honest, telling her he had broken her property and always paid his debts. Maeve walked around the counter until she was standing close to him. She did not look away from his pale face. She reached out and placed her hand firmly on his arm, feeling the cold strength of his muscle beneath the linen. She told him he did not owe her anything, because he paid his rent and worked hard every day. She told him he did not have to earn his place in her home. "You should not be kind to me, Maeve," Caspian whispered, his voice dropping low as he looked down at her hand. He told her it would not end well for either of them if people found out what he was. "I am not kind," she said, letting go of his arm with a sharp nod. She told him she was just being practical because he was a good cook, ordering him to empty the bucket before it froze. The heavy storm returned on a cold Tuesday afternoon, bringing a thick sleet that turned the mountain roads into sheets of solid ice. The inn was completely empty, the bitter weather keeping even the local drunks inside their small cabins. Maeve was down in the root cellar counting her remaining logs of wood when she heard the sudden sound of horses entering the courtyard outside. It was a sharp, fast rhythm of iron shoes striking the frozen stone, different from the slow walk of a farm horse. Maeve dropped her wood log, her heart stopping for a second as the dull thud echoed in the dark cellar. She ran up the wooden steps into the kitchen, her breath coming in short gasps. Caspian was at the table, a knife in his hand, but he stopped moving the moment he saw her face. "Soldiers are outside," Maeve whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Caspian did not panic. He simply went completely still, his light gray eyes narrowing as he looked toward the front door. He reached down to his boot and drew a long hunting knife, the steel gleaming in the dim kitchen light. He started to walk toward the front room, but Maeve grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all her strength. "You cannot fight 6 armed men by yourself," she hissed, her fingers digging into his shirt. Caspian told her he would not let them destroy her home looking for him, his pale face turning hard and fierce. Maeve shoved him toward the back of the cellar, telling him to hide behind the empty cider barrels, where her father had built a secret wooden wall to hide old bottles of liquor. She told him to stay completely quiet, warning him she would throw him out herself if he made a sound. A heavy fist slammed against the front door, shouting for them to open up in the name of the law. Maeve pushed Caspian down the cellar steps, slammed the wooden door shut, and dragged a heavy sack of grain over the seam to hide the edges from view. She took a deep breath, smoothing her dirty apron, and walked into the front room just as a heavy iron boot kicked the broken latch open. 6 soldiers in thick blue coats stepped inside, their swords clinking against their armor. They smelled of wet horses and cold steel. Their leader was a tall man with a scar across his nose and eyes like dark flint, looking around the empty tavern with a scowl. "Why did you take so long to open the door, woman?" the leader barked, shaking the freezing sleet from his heavy cloak. Maeve did not back away from him. She stood behind her bar and crossed her arms, telling him she was in the kitchen and asking who was going to pay for her broken door latch. The leader sneered, pulling a piece of paper from his belt. "We are looking for a dangerous rebel who fled from the northern border," the leader said, describing a man with white hair, pale skin, and a royal ring. He asked if any strangers had come through the hollow. Maeve looked at the paper, then looked at the soldiers with a bored expression, telling them the only people who came to her inn were old farmers who complained about the price of ale. The leader narrowed his eyes, studying her face for any sign of a lie, but Maeve kept her eyes steady and cold. She told him they could search the rooms if they wanted, but if they tracked mud on her clean floors, she would make them scrub it. The leader waved his hand sharply, ordering his men to check every corner of the house and leave nothing unturned. Maeve watched them walk upstairs, her ears tracking the sound of her wooden chairs being thrown to the floor and mattresses being ripped open. A soldier pushed into the kitchen, his heavy boots clicking on the stone. He kicked the grain sack near the cellar door, causing a small cloud of white dust to rise into the air. Maeve held her breath, her hands clenching behind her back until her nails bit into her skin. "The kitchen is empty, Captain," the soldier shouted, walking back into the main room while wiping the dust from his leather boot. The other men came down the stairs a few minutes later, shaking their heads to show they had found nothing. Caspian was always neat, making his bed every morning with perfect lines, leaving no trace of his presence in room 4. The leader frowned, looking at Maeve one last time before wrapping his cloak around his neck. He told her that if she was hiding the white-haired traitor, she would hang from her own ceiling beams. Maeve told him she understood her own business, and watched him march out into the storm with his men, their horses galloping away into the gray sleet. She waited 5 minutes until the sound of the hoofbeats was completely gone. Then she pushed the heavy table against the broken front door to keep the cold wind out. Her legs felt like water, and she sank to the floor behind the bar, breathing heavily as the fear finally caught up with her. She had just lied to the law to save a vampire king she had known for only 3 weeks. She forced herself to stand up, her knees shaking as she hurried into the kitchen. She pushed the heavy grain sack away from the floor and pulled the cellar door open, calling his name into the dark. A soft sound came from the back behind the old barrels, and the secret wooden panel moved aside. Caspian stepped out into the light, his pale face looking weary and tight from the small space. He did not say anything. He walked up the steps in 3 long strides, reached out, and caught her by the shoulders, his grip tight and cold. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his white hair brushing against her cheek as his shoulders shook with a deep, quiet relief. Maeve hesitated for a moment, then wrapped her arms around his broad back, holding him close in the warm kitchen. "I must leave tonight, Maeve," he whispered against her skin, his breath cold. He told her the soldiers would return when they found no tracks in the snow, and he would not let her hang for his past. Maeve tightened her grip on his coat, telling him he was not going anywhere, because this was her inn, and she was the one who decided who stayed and who left. The white snow covered the mountain valley for 2 more weeks, turning the world outside into a quiet, frozen place where nothing moved. Inside the red maple, everything had changed between them. Caspian no longer stayed in the shadows of room 4 or pretended to be a wandering traveler. He took over all the hard work of the inn, cutting wood and repairing the broken boards of the stable. He always kept his hunting knife tucked into his leather belt, his gray eyes constantly watching the windows for any sign of blue coats, but he did not speak of the soldiers again. It was a cold Sunday evening when the work was done, and the tavern was quiet. A large fire was roaring in the stone hearth, casting a warm red glow over the pine floorboards where they sat together. Maeve was sitting by the table, trying to sew a tear in an old linen sheet with a small bone needle. Her fingers felt stiff from the cold, and she kept looking across the room at him. Caspian was sitting on the low wooden stool, using an old rag to polish the brass handle of her water bucket, his long, pale fingers moving with steady care. "You are watching me again, Maeve," he said softly, not lifting his eyes from the yellow metal. Maeve did not drop her needle, telling him she was just trying to understand how a high king learned how to fix old roofs and make bean stew. Caspian stopped his hand, setting the rag down on his knee as he looked at her across the firelight. "A king does not know these things, Maeve, but a soldier does," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He told her he had spent 10 years fighting on the frozen northern borders after his father sent him to the camps at 16. He said he was supposed to sit in a grand tent, but instead he had learned how his people lived and died in the cold mud. He stood up and walked over to her table, standing in the warm glow of the fire. He told her he had not told her the whole truth about the border village he had refused to destroy. He said it was simply the first time he had found the strength to say no to his family after a decade of following orders because he was afraid of his own crown. "I am not a good man, Maeve," he whispered, looking down at his pale hands. He told her his skin was stained with the memories of all the innocent people he had failed to save before he ran away into the mountains. He looked at her with his light gray eyes, waiting for her to tell him to leave, believing he deserved to be cast out into the freezing night. Maeve looked at his white hair, and his pale face, seeing the deep sorrow that he carried inside his chest. She knew he was a creature of the dark, a king who had known great violence, but she also knew the man who had fixed her porch and cooked her food. She put her needle down on the table and stood up, stepping close to him until she could feel the cold air radiating from his skin. "You are broken, and I am broken," she said, her voice steady as she reached out to touch his patched black coat. She told him they were all just trying to keep the roof from falling down on their heads in a hard world. Caspian let out a long, shaky breath, his cold hands coming up to rest gently against her waist, his touch lighter than a feather. "I cannot give you a safe life, Maeve," he said, his gray eyes searching her face. Maeve smiled faintly, her hand moving up to cup his pale jaw, her thumb brushing against the small scar on his skin. She told him she had never had a safe life anyway, and she did not need a protector. She told him she only needed someone to help her keep the fire hot and the doors locked. Caspian closed his eyes, a small, genuine laugh coming from his chest as he wrapped his arms completely around her, pulling her against his cold chest. They stood together by the roaring fire, completely safe from the freezing winter outside. They were like two broken pieces of stone that had found a way to fit perfectly together. And Maeve knew that no matter what the town council or the soldiers did, the white-haired king would never leave her in. The future did not look like a grand story from an old book, and the red maple would always have a draft coming through the floorboards during the long winter months. There would always be bills to pay to the town council, and her hands would always be red from the cold water of the wash bucket. But as Maeve looked at the bright fire and heard the quiet sound of Caspian stacking the wood in the corner, she felt a strange, quiet peace settle deep inside her mind. The heavy oak steps no longer groaned when she walked on them, and the front door closed with a solid, safe click that kept the mountain wind outside where it belonged. People in the valley would always whisper about the strange, pale handyman with white hair who worked in her kitchen, and the town collectors would always look at her with suspicious eyes whenever they passed the lane. But she knew they had found a way to build a small, warm world inside these old stone walls, a place where a hidden king could find rest from his old wars, and where an overworked woman could find a shoulder to lean on when the days grew long. They would face the spring when the snow finally melted from the hills, and if the blue-coated soldiers ever returned to the hollow, they would find two people standing together behind a locked door, ready to hold their ground against whatever came down the mountain road. She closed her account book and let her head rest against his shoulder, watching the last red embers of the fire turn to quiet gray ash in the dark.